The dress was white. That was the singular, blinding detail Lyra would remember, vivid and sharp in the quiet moments long after. Not the echoing laughter of the guests, not the overlapping voices filtering through the courtyard, not even the way the heavy afternoon light cut through the stable doors like an ominous warning. She had never intended to stop outside the great hall's side entrance. She had simply needed a single breath of cold air, one desperate moment of stillness before she was forced to walk down that crowded aisle and alter the course of her life forever. But the heavy timber door was cracked open just an inch, and Vane's voice carried through the gap with effortless clarity. "It does not matter if she is my fated mate or not," Vane had said. His tone as casual and untroubled as a man discussing the evening weather. "Once she is marked, she belongs to me. That is simply how the world works." In that heartbeat, everything stopped. Lyra stood frozen in the doorway for 4 agonizing seconds as the reality of his words settled into her bones. And then she ran. She did not plan an escape. She did not calculate her chances. She simply flew through the shadows of the back corridor, burst into the cavernous stables, and threw herself onto the back of the nearest horse. He was an enormous black stallion who, by every law of nature, temperament, and sheer instinct, should have thrown her to the dirt immediately. Instead, he ran with her. He carried her away from the iron cage of her pack, surging into the wilderness. She would not discover just whose horse she had taken until 3 long days had passed. By then, Alpha King Kalen was already hunting for her, and he was not sending his soldiers to do his bidding.
He was coming himself.
This is where her story truly begins. She did not know where she was going. That was the absolute, undeniable truth of it. There was no destination mapped in her mind, no strategy, no coin tucked into the folds of her dress, nothing but the stinging lash of the cold night air hitting her face and the rhythmic drumming of heavy hooves beneath her. The ancient forest blurred past in long, chaotic streaks of dark and darker still. Low-hanging branches clawed viciously at her hair, tearing the neat strands loose. The pristine white hem of her ceremony dress was already ruined, stained with earth and catching the wind behind her like a torn, forgotten flag. She should have been terrified, and a part of her was trembling to the core. But beneath the suffocating fear was something entirely new, something she had no name for yet, something that felt embarrassingly, beautifully, like breathing. She had not drawn a proper breath in months. The stallion ran as if he had a specific destination in mind. That was the first thing that truly unsettled her. She had gripped the leather reins, expecting a violent fight, expecting to force her will upon him and guide his path. But the black stallion clearly had his own ideas entirely. Every time she attempted to pull him left toward the safety of familiar territory, the beast corrected his course without a moment of hesitation. Every time she tried to slacken her hands to slow his frantic pace, he picked up speed, his muscles bunching and flexing beneath her. He was not following her direction. He was leading this flight, and she was simply holding on for her life. "Okay," she said aloud to no one, her voice swallowed by the rush of the trees and the vastness of the night. "Okay." She stopped fighting his lead. The night stretched out ahead of them, vast and entirely moonless.
She lost all track of time somewhere within the first hour of their flight, and she lost her sense of direction entirely by the second.
By the third hour, she had accepted the reality that she was completely and irreversibly lost, and that the stallion seemed entirely unbothered by that fact. She began to talk to him, because the silence of the dark woods was too heavy to bear, and there was nothing else left to do. She told him about the delicate white flowers her mother, Myra, that painstakingly braided into her hair that morning, flowers that were still clinging to her head, half unraveled, their petals long gone. She told him about the way Myra had pressed the heavy fabric of the wedding dress into her hands with shining, hopeful eyes, dreaming of a secure future. She told him about the way Vane had smiled at the pre-ceremony gathering, all sharp charm and overflowing confidence, looking exactly like a man collecting a prize he had already paid for. The horse's ears twitched backward, listening to the rhythm of her voice, or performing something close enough to it to comfort her. Dawn broke slowly, a pale grid of gray and cold filtering through the dense pine canopy in thin, fragile strips of light. Lyra's arms ached with a dull intensity. Her back felt stiff, and the insides of her knees, pressed hard against the stallion's powerful flanks for hours on end, throbbed in ways she had never known her body could ache. But the trees were finally thinning ahead, and the low, rushing sound of moving water reached her ears. The stallion slowed his pace entirely on his own accord. A clear creek appeared through the tree line, narrow and running fast over smooth, water-worn stones at the edge of what felt like the absolute border of everything she had ever known. The stallion walked calmly to the bank and lowered his massive head to drink, with the quiet authority of an animal who had simply completed a daily chore. Lyra slid off his broad back, her legs buckling beneath her, and she nearly collapsed onto the damp earth. She stood frozen for a long moment, with her hands resting heavily on her knees, catching her ragged breath, staring at the rushing water, looking up at the gray sky, looking at anything to avoid the terrifying reality of what she had done. Then, the faint creak of wooden wheels cut through the morning air. A covered cart emerged slowly from the dense tree line on the far side of the creek. A traveling merchant's rig pulled by two unremarkable brown mares. The man driving it was weathered and old, his face lined with the squinting expression of someone who had seen most things the world had to offer and had been surprised by very few of them. The traveler pulled his cart to a sudden stop. He looked across the water at Lyra. Then his eyes drifted to the magnificent black horse standing beside her. All the color drained from the old man's face. It did not happen quickly. It drained slowly, the way water leaves a cracked vessel, until only a pale ghost remains. He set down his leather reins with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had suddenly decided that any sudden motion would be dangerous. "Girl," the old man, Ryan, said very quietly across the creek, "where did you get that horse?" Lyra straightened her spine, trying to smooth her ruined dress. "The stables back at my pack settlement," she explained, her voice tight. I needed a horse, and he was there, and I took him." "Which stables?" Ryan asked, his eyes wide. "Ironvale Pack, the eastern settlement," she replied. She frowned deeply at his shifting expression, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "Why? What is wrong?"
Rian was quiet for a long, heavy moment.
He looked at the stallion once more, taking in the immense, powerful lines of his build, the deep, midnight black coat, and the particular regal way the animal stood, as if the earth beneath his hooves was a polite courtesy he was extending to the ground rather than a surface he required to stand on. "That," the old man said with immense care, "is Brimstone." The name landed between them without context. Lyra waited, her heart beating faster against her ribs. "That is the Alpha King's horse," Rian said, uttering the words the way people say things they expect to shatter a room. "Alpha King Kalen's legendary stallion, known across every territory and settlement in the north." The merchant paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. There is not another horse like him anywhere in the world. Every wolf from this creek to the mountain boundary would recognize that beast on sight. The creek kept running, bubbling over the rocks. A wild bird called out from somewhere high above them, entirely indifferent to the sudden terror gripping her heart. Lyra turned her head slowly and looked at the horse. The stallion lifted his head from the water, droplets clinging to his muzzle, and looked directly back at her. His dark eyes were steady and impossibly deep, holding an unmistakable intelligence that she had noticed the previous night but had dismissed as a trick of her desperate imagination. It was not imagination. She thought back to the way he had stood perfectly still when she had scrambled onto his back in the dark. She thought of the way he had run into the night without a single second of hesitation. She thought of the way he had led her here, to this specific creek, to this exact border, with the total certainty of an animal who knew exactly what he was doing and where he was going. "He let me ride him," she murmured, mostly to herself. "Yes," Rian the merchant said, his voice dropping an octave as he prepared to leave. "That is the other problem." She understood completely then. The truth did not hit her all at once, but arrived in heavy, crushing pieces, each one weightier than the last. The Alpha King's personal stallion, a horse that accepted no riders but his master. A horse that half the northern territories would recognize instantly. And that very horse was currently standing peacefully beside a runaway Omega wearing a mud-splattered wedding dress at the absolute edge of her pack's territory. Rian clicked his tongue sharply to his brown mares and guided his cart slowly around the bend of the creek, wanting absolutely no part of whatever storm was coming next. Lyra stood entirely alone in the cold, gray morning light. Then she made the only decision that made any sense to her. She had to find the king. She had to return the legendary stallion before a battalion of royal guards came hunting for her. And she had to pray with everything she had left in her soul that she found the Alpha King before he found her. The Great Hall of Blackwood Keep was built for exactly this kind of crushing silence. It featured stone walls 4 feet thick, soaring ceilings that swallowed sound entirely, and torches that burned steadily without flickering, because the ancient architects who raised this fortress understood that a king's hall should feel like the inside of a held breath. It was a room explicitly designed to make ordinary men feel small, and it succeeded reliably at that task day after day. The scout, standing in the dead center of the chamber, looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. He had ridden hard through the night,
That much was written plainly in the mud caked on his leather boots. The dust clinging to his high collar, and the hollow, exhausted look around his eyes that only came from hours in the saddle. But he carried the added burden of bearing news he wasn't entirely sure he believed himself. He had already repeated the tale twice at the outer gates, once to the senior sentinel and once to the second in command. And each time the response had been the same slow, disbelieving blink before he was told to keep moving forward until he reached the throne. Now he stood before King Kaelin and said it for the third time. Brimstone carried her willingly, my lord, out of Ironvale territory, through the darkness of the night. The scout paused, swallowing hard before finishing. She did not steal him, sire. The horse went with her. The hall became profoundly quiet. Kaelin sat at the head of the long timber council table, one large hand resting flat against the dark wood, his expression giving away absolutely nothing of his inner thoughts. He was a powerful, imposing man, not in the exaggerated, boastful way of lords who needed size to project authority, but in the quiet way of someone built by decades of actual conflict and heavy rule. There were faint lines etched at the corners of his sharp eyes, and a jagged scar ran along his jawline, long since faded to a pale silver. He looked exactly like what he was, a leader who had been making incredibly difficult decisions for a very long time, and who had stopped being surprised by the strange turns of the world. Yet he had not been expecting this. His council recovered from the shock first. 3 senior wolves began speaking all at once, their voices echoing off the stone, each arriving at the same aggressive conclusion from different angles. They called for enforcers, a swift retrieval team, a formal complaint dispatched to the Ironvale Pack elders, and a harsh punishment appropriate to the severity of stealing from the crown. Kaelin simply let them talk, listening to the noise. When they finally fell silent, he remained quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone in the room. "I will go myself," Kaelin said. The declaration landed badly. His second-in-command, Torin, a broad, battle-scarred wolf commander who had served faithfully beside Kaelin for 11 years and had thoroughly earned the right to argue, pushed back against the decision immediately. He insisted it was far beneath the king's personal attention. He argued it was a severe misallocation of royal resources. He claimed it was exactly the kind of personal involvement that needlessly complicated what should be a simple asset retrieval. Kaelin listened to every piece of protest with the absolute patience of a man who had already made up his mind before the first word was spoken. "The horse chose her," Kaelin said. Those 4 words were final in a way that required no raised volume. Torin snapped his mouth shut, the argument dying in his throat. Kaelin stood up from the table, and the entire room stood with him, out of pure, conditioned instinct. "Prepare a small escort," the king commanded. "We ride within the hour." He offered no further explanation to his council, and he wasn't entirely sure he could have if they pressed him for one. The technical theft of the animal was almost completely irrelevant to him. Brimstone was not a horse that could be kept anywhere he did not actively choose to be. And whoever this mysterious runaway woman was, she would discover that truth quickly enough. What pulled at Kaelin, the single detail he could not set down no matter how practically he tried to analyze it, was the scout's secondary report. The stallion had chosen her. In 15 long years, Brimstone had chosen no one. Not visiting alphas from distant lands, not honored military allies, not even Kalen's own senior commanders like Torin. The stallion had thrown men twice Lyra's size without a shred of ceremony, and had shown absolutely no remorse about leaving them in the dirt. He was not a difficult or malicious animal. He was simply a decided one, and he had decided consistently that only one person on Earth was worth carrying. Until last night. Kalen rode out of the keep with a small escort of 4 trusted wolves, maintaining a steady, unhurried pace. He told himself this was merely an act of professional curiosity, a reasonable investigation into a strange anomaly, and nothing more. He almost believed the lie. 2 territories to the east, Lyra had completely stopped trying to navigate the wild forest. This choice was born partly from sheer physical exhaustion and partly from undeniable logic. She had spent the better part of the morning attempting to guide Brimstone toward what she believed was the general direction of Kalen's northern territory. Working entirely from half-remembered geography lessons and a firm conviction that returning the horse quickly was her best available option for survival. Brimstone had cooperated with absolutely none of her efforts. He wasn't aggressive about his rebellion. He did not fight against the leather reins or resist the pressure of her hands on his neck. He simply redirected their path with the quiet, unyielding confidence of someone correcting a small factual error in conversation, and then continued marching in whatever direction he had already decided upon. Lyra had given up entirely after his 4th seamless correction. "You are going somewhere specific, aren't you?" she asked him aloud. The trees were incredibly dense in this stretch of the wild. An old-growth pine forest, so thick it blocked out the sky completely and turned the bright midday hours into something closer to an eerie dusk. Her voice sounded thin and strange in the absolute stillness of the woods. "Aren't you?" she repeated. Brimstone's ears moved slightly, twitching back toward her. It wasn't really a question she expected him to answer. She had begun talking to the stallion around sunrise, right when the suffocating silence of the ancient forest had become too massive a weight for her to carry alone. It helped her, surprisingly. The horse was an infinitely better listener than most people she had known back in her settlement. He was attentive in a way that felt completely genuine, and he was responsive without offering any unwanted opinions or judgments on her choices. "I need to find your owner," she told the stallion as they walked. "I need to find him before he finds me, because I imagine being hunted down and captured is considerably worse than arriving at his gates voluntarily." She paused, looking down at the dark mane. "You understand that, don't you? It is a dignity issue." Brimstone walked on, his stride steady, powerful, and completely unhurried. The forest began to shift around them as the hours ticked away. The dense pines thinned slightly, the ground beneath the hooves rose at a sharp incline, and the crisp air carried something much colder and sharper that tasted distinctly of high altitude. Lyra pulled the torn fabric of her white ceremony dress tighter across her bare shoulders and looked up at the pale sky breaking through the high canopy above. She was suddenly overcome by a slow, deeply uncomfortable feeling. Brimstone was not taking her to find the king at all. The horse was taking her to the exact spot where the king would find her. Those were 2 very different realities. And somewhere behind her, already riding hard through the wilderness, King Kalen was rapidly closing the distance between them. Driven forward by 4 simple words he could not stop turning over in his mind. The horse chose her. He needed to understand why. Kaelin had constructed a very specific version of this woman in his mind over the course of their 3 days of tracking. It happened automatically, the way a veteran military strategist naturally fills in the blanks of an unknown map, building a psychological picture from the available details to prepare for what he was likely to encounter. The woman who had walked boldly into a packed, chaotic settlement stable on her wedding day, identified the most valuable and dangerous stallion in the Northern Territories, and disappeared with him into the treacherous night, was either extraordinarily bold or extraordinarily desperate. Kaelin had settled firmly on bold. It made the most tactical sense to him. Desperation made ordinary people reckless and sloppy, but boldness made them calculating. A calculating person would have a defined plan, a clear destination in mind, and possibly dangerous allies waiting for her somewhere across the border. He had prepared his men accordingly for a confrontation. He had not prepared for the reality before him. She was sitting quietly on a fallen pine log at the very edge of a deep ravine. Her ruined white wedding dress tucked tightly around her knees to keep out the chill. Both of her hands were raised to her own head in the concentrated, frustrated effort of someone trying desperately to braid her own hair without a mirror. She was losing the battle completely. Several thick sections of dark hair had already escaped her fingers, and she was clearly negotiating with the remaining strands in frustration. Brimstone stood directly beside her, his massive, terrifying head resting heavily on her delicate shoulder with the absolute ease of an animal who had been doing this for years rather than a mere 3 days. She was talking to the stallion in a low, soft murmur, the way people talk when they believe with absolute certainty that no one is around to listen. Kaelin brought his horse to a sudden halt at the tree line. Behind him, he heard Torin exhale slowly in pure disbelief. The king raised one hand to his men. "Stay back," he ordered quietly, and then he rode forward into the clearing alone. She heard the approach of his horse when he was still 20 feet away. Her head snapped up instantly. Her hands dropped from her messy hair, and she was on her feet before Kaelin had fully cleared the shadow of the trees. The expression washing over her face moved through several distinct emotions in rapid succession. First came recognition, which meant she knew exactly who he was, followed immediately by the crushing quality of fear that comes not from the threat of physical violence, but from the weight of consequence. It was the distinct fear of someone who knows they have done something wrong and has spent every waking moment dreading this exact reckoning. What she did next was something he had not anticipated at all. Instead of fleeing or begging, she grabbed Brimstone's leather reins, walked straight toward the imposing Alpha King, and held them up to him and began talking rapidly. "I am so sorry," she said, her words rushing out. "I know exactly how this looks, and I know there is absolutely nothing I can say that adequately explains taking your horse without your permission. But I want you to know that I took very good care of him, and he was never in any danger at all. And I was actually trying to find you to return him to your keep, because I have been trying to find your territory for 2 days now, but he keeps..." She glanced back at Brimstone briefly, her eyes wide. "He keeps deciding where we go, which I realize also sounds like a ridiculous thing a person would say just to avoid taking responsibility for a crime. But I promise you. Stop, Kaylin said. She froze instantly, her voice cutting off. He looked down at her from his saddle, truly looked at her. He scanned her face the way he had learned to look at people over 15 years of separating raw truth from a practiced performance. The dress had clearly been white once. Now, the hem was entirely destroyed, stained dark with mud, moss, and forest debris. And there was a long tear along the left shoulder that had been inexpertly knotted together to keep the fabric from widening any further. Her hair was half undone, falling around her face in wild waves. There was a small, thin scratch along her collarbone, the unmistakable kind left by a low-hanging branch encountered at high speed in the dark. Yet she was holding the heavy reins out to him with both of her hands, steady and unyielding, despite the vibrant fear visible in every other part of her frame. She was waiting for whatever punishment came next, with the quiet stillness of someone who had learned the hard way that waiting was far safer than speaking. He did not reach down to take the reins from her hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked instead. She blinked in pure surprise. No, I am fine," she stammered. Then, with an earnestness that struck the king as almost absurd, given the high stakes of the confrontation, she turned her back on him to check Brimstone's legs. She ran her small hands gently along the stallion's powerful foreleg, checking the hoof and examining the ankle with the careful attention of someone who genuinely knew what they were looking for in a horse. "He is not hurt either," she reported, looking back up. "I made sure we did not push him too hard after the first night of riding. And I found clean, good water for him twice." "You are more concerned about the welfare of the horse than about your own situation," Kaylin observed, his voice neutral. She straightened up, her cheeks flushing as she seemed to realize how that devotion looked to a stranger. "You love him," she said simply, looking at the beast. "I did not want him to be harmed because of something I chose to do." Kaylin remained quiet for a long moment. His armed escort was still waiting back in the shadows of the trees. The deep ravine dropped away sharply to his left, the rushing creek at its rocky base catching the golden afternoon light. Brimstone had not moved an inch from his protective position beside the woman. The horse had not, Kaylin noted with a spike of intrigue, even shifted his head or acknowledged his master's arrival. "What were you running from?" Kaylin asked softly. Her expression changed instantly. The practical, immediate fear concerning stolen horses, royal consequences, and explanations shifted into something much quieter, deeper, and infinitely more complicated. She looked down at the earth briefly, breaking eye contact. Then she looked back up into the eyes of the Alpha King, and she told him the truth. Not everything, and not all at once, but enough for him to understand. She spoke of the heavy ceremony dress that had been purchased years in advance by a hopeful family. She spoke of the chilling words she had overheard through a cracked timber door. She described the particular casual cruelty of a man explaining to his peers that possession and partnership were the exact same thing in his eyes, and that he saw no reason they shouldn't be. She told the story plainly, without any dramatic performance, and without asking him for a shred of sympathy. The heavy words came out of her like a formal report she was simply delivering. as though she had already spent 3 days in the woods, deciding which parts of the memory were real and which parts she might have misunderstood in her panic. Arriving finally at the absolute conclusion that she had not misunderstood a single thing. When she finished speaking, she met his intense gaze and waited for his judgment. Kalen looked down at her for a long, silent moment. He thought about the formidable version of the thief he had constructed over his 3 days of hard riding, bold, calculating, and tactically prepared. He thought about what he had actually found in this clearing instead. A woman who had taken a royal horse in a moment of pure, blinding desperation, and who had spent the days since trying to make the mistake right. A woman who had checked his stallion's legs for injury before defending her own life. He thought about the singular word she had not once used during her explanation, even when describing the man who had used it so freely against her. Belong. The Alpha King made a decision right then, and it surprised even himself. "You will travel with me," he said, "until you know what you want to do next." He laid out the terms of his offer simply, without any unnecessary decoration or political fluff. She would travel alongside his royal escort toward the fortress of the Northern Keep. She would be provided with hot food, warm shelter, and full protection for the duration of the journey. He promised he would not make any contact with the Iron Veil Pack regarding her whereabouts, nor would he facilitate any legal or personal arrangement with Vane. In return for this protection, he expected absolute honesty from her. If she knew of anything relevant to her situation that she had not yet disclosed, she would tell him immediately. When she finally decided what she wanted to do next with her life, she would tell him that too. At that point, they would sit down and discuss what options were safely available to her. He delivered all of this in the exact same level tone a man might use to outline a routine border trade agreement. Calm, clear, and entirely without pressure. Lyra listened intently to every single word. Then she looked up at him and asked, "Why?" Kalen looked back at her. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "You do not know me. I took your most valuable horse. You could have easily handed me right back to my pack elders this morning and had the entire legal matter resolved before nightfall." She wasn't being combative or aggressive. Her voice was careful, measured, and genuinely trying to comprehend his motives. "So, why?" she repeated. The escort was watching them from the tree line, and Kalen was acutely aware of it. 4 veteran wolves were currently pretending not to listen to the conversation, with the professional transparency of men who were absolutely absorbing every single syllable. The king considered several diplomatic answers before discarding them all. "Because nothing you have told me suggests you deserve to be handed back to a cage," he said finally. "And I do not make permanent decisions before I have gathered enough information." Lyra studied his face for a long moment with an expression that was equal parts deep skepticism and something far more fragile underneath. It was the look of someone who wanted badly to believe a good thing, but had learned through bitter experience to be incredibly careful about that particular desire. "All right," she said. Her response was not warm, nor was it filled with relief. It was delivered with the careful, the guarded agreement of someone accepting terms they fully intended to honor while remaining entirely alert for the hidden catch. Kalen found himself deeply respecting that caution. The first evening at camp was distinctly uncomfortable, carrying the specific tension of people who do not yet know each other's boundaries and edges. They made their camp in a shallow, hidden clearing just off the main mountain track, sheltered on two sides by a steep rock face and towering old-growth pines. The soldiers moved with practiced military efficiency. The fire was built quickly, bedrolls were positioned, and the functional rhythm of men who had made camp in far worse places, under far worse conditions, took over. Lyra stood slightly outside the circle of activity. She was not quite inside the camp, yet not quite outside it either. Clearly uncertain whether she was considered an honored guest or something with a much less comfortable definition. She had been given a fresh change of clothes from the escort's travel supplies. Practical, heavy wear that was slightly too large for her frame, forcing her to roll the long sleeves back at her wrists. The ruined white ceremony dress was finally gone. Kaylin had noticed the exact moment she stopped moving carefully to preserve the white fabric. The exact moment she had accepted that it was already ruined beyond any sentimentality, folding it away into a leather saddlebag without any ceremony. The king kept his distance throughout the evening. He ate his rations with his men, spoke quietly with Torin about their route and tomorrow's timing, and purposefully let her find her own equilibrium without the added pressure of his direct attention. It did not entirely work to ease her tension. Every single time one of his soldiers moved anywhere near her, even just to hand her a plate of food, even just to add fresh wood to the crackling fire, she went completely still, in the way of a wild animal contemplating running. Her eyes showed rapid, silent calculations. She wasn't afraid of the men specifically. She was afraid of what their sheer presence meant, of the massive authority they represented, and of being trapped in a situation where other people controlled the terms of her existence. She sat closest to Brimstone. The massive stallion had intentionally positioned his bulky frame at the very edge of the firelight nearest to her, and he remained there, immovable, with the settled permanence of an animal who had made a definitive decision about exactly where he belonged this evening. When one of the soldiers attempted to take his lead rope to guide him to the picket line with the other horses, Brimstone looked at the man with profound, freezing indifference and did not budge an inch. The soldier looked over at Kaylin in confusion. Kaylin made a small, waving gesture with his hand. "Leave him," the king ordered. The fire burned lower into the night, the embers glowing red. The soldiers finally settled into their bedrolls. The ancient forest darkened around them, entering the particular deep quiet of the true wilderness, the rhythmic sound of insects, the sigh of the wind through the high pines, and the distant rushing murmur of the creek below the ridge. Lyra spoke up suddenly, without looking at him. "Why did he choose me?" Kaylin looked up from his watch by the dying fire. She was staring intently at Brimstone, her knees drawn up to her chest, both of her hands wrapped tightly around the warm tin cup she had been given. "You said he has never carried anyone else in all these years," she murmured, her voice soft in the dark. "So why did he let me ride him? I did not do anything special or magical. I just grabbed the leather reins in the dark, and he went." She shook her head slightly, the firelight catching the movement. "It does not make any sense." Kaylin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the flames. There were things he could have said to her then, truths about instinct and the hidden nature of wolves that she wasn't ready to hear.
He could have constructed countless authoritative, reasonable explanations that would have satisfied any ordinary inquiry. Kalen was not, as a general rule, a man who comfortably admitted the limits of his own understanding. Not in the high council chambers, not during intense border negotiations, and certainly not in the dozen daily moments where an Alpha King's absolute certainty functioned as a necessary instrument of peace and order. "I do not know," Kalen said. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the dying embers. "I have had that stallion for 9 years," Kalen continued, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I know his temperament better than I know most people's. What he did at the border has never happened before, and I cannot explain it."
He paused, the silence stretching between them. "That bothers me considerably." Lyra remained quiet for a long moment, and then something in her shoulders finally released.
It was a tension so habitual, so deeply ingrained, that she had probably stopped feeling it altogether. Now it dropped almost imperceptibly, like a tightly wound knot worked loose after a long, exhausting time. She looked back at the fire. "Okay," she said quietly. The word was not meant for him, exactly. It was spoken to herself, or perhaps to the momentous decision she was still in the slow process of making. Kalen watched her from across the hearth and said nothing more. He had told her the absolute truth. He did not know why Brimstone had chosen her. But as he watched the firelight trace the sharp line of her jaw, he was beginning to think that the answer mattered considerably more than retrieving the royal stallion ever had. It did not happen all at once. That was the thing about walls built over years of survival. They did not come down in a single earth-shattering moment of revelation. They melted away the way frost leaves a window pane, slowly from the outer edges. In the quiet places where warmth had been persistently present long enough to finally matter. On the first morning of their journey, Lyra had eaten her breakfast facing slightly away from the group. Her shoulders angled protectively toward the shadows, her conversation minimal and guarded. On the second morning, she had accepted a portion of food without startling when the soldier's hand came close to her space. By the fourth day, she was sitting fully inside the sacred circle of the campfire, and Kalen noted the shift, the way he noted most things, quietly, without drawing any unnecessary attention to the noticing. The royal escort noticed the change too, though they wisely said nothing. They were good men, trained to read the wind, but respectful of boundaries. The real shift, when it came, arrived without announcement. They were riding through a dense, claustrophobic stretch of pine corridor. It was the kind of ancient trail that narrowed just enough to force the horses into a single-file line, making conversation difficult unless you raised your voice against the wind. Kalen had been navigating the dense terrain by memory, and he made a minor, rare miscalculation. He took a fork in the trail that added an extra quarter of a mile before he recognized the error and corrected his course without a word. Lyra, riding Brimstone just behind him, was silent for a moment. Then her voice cut through the rhythmic thud of hooves. "You went the wrong way." Kalen kept his eyes firmly on the trail ahead. I adjusted. "You went left at the fork," she countered smoothly. "The creek sounds have been on our right side since this morning, which means we have been tracking northeast. Going left took us further northeast, when we should have been pulling west to clear the ridge." A brief pause hung in the crisp air. "You have been paying close attention to the creek sounds," Kalen said.
I have been paying attention to everything, she said, her tone sharpening with defensive pride. I am in unfamiliar territory, with people I do not know. Of course I have. He considered her words. It was, he decided, an entirely reasonable position. It was also entirely correct.
He had indeed gone the wrong way.
You are right, he said. He heard her shift in the leather saddle behind him, the sudden adjustment of someone who had braced herself for a harsh argument and received calm agreement instead. She did not quite know what to do with the surplus defensive energy. They rode in silence for another full minute.
Most people do not tell me when I am wrong, Kaylin remarked quietly.
Most people are probably worried about what happens to them if they do.
And you are not? He asked, tilting his head slightly.
I am a little worried, Lyra admitted honestly. I just decided that speaking up was worth the risk. Kaylin said nothing in return, but something at the corner of his mouth moved in a slight phantom curve. If any of his formal council members had been present to witness it, the expression would have confused them considerably. It was 2 days later when she finally laughed. They had stopped at midday near a wide, flat rock that caught the full warmth of the sun. Kaylin was in the middle of a completely straightforward, deadpan description of a mundane trade dispute he had mediated the previous winter. It involved 2 stubborn pack elders, a disputed boundary stone, and a single chaotic goat that both parties claimed as vital legal evidence. He delivered the absurd ending of the story in a tone so completely dry and utterly absent of any indication that he found it amusing that it took Lyra 3 full seconds to realize he was joking. Then she laughed. It was a genuine, full-bellied laugh. The kind of beautiful sound that arrives entirely before the conscious decision to laugh can stop it. Realizing what she had done, she instantly clapped her hand over her mouth. Kaylin looked back at her, his expression mild. "What?" he asked. "What did you think would happen?" She lowered her hand slowly, a faint flush on her cheeks. "I do not know. Nothing. I just..." She stopped, seeming to decide that absolute honesty was simpler than fabricating an excuse. "Everyone talks about you like you are carved from something ancient that does not possess a sense of humor. I am well aware of that reputation. You could correct that impression if you wanted to," she suggested. "I find it far too useful," he said plainly. "People are much more efficient when they are slightly uncomfortable. Meetings end significantly faster that way." She stared at him, bewildered. "That might be the most deliberately intimidating thing I have ever heard," she said. "And you said it like it was completely reasonable." "It is completely reasonable." "It is." She pressed her lips tightly together, and Kaylin could see her working hard against another wave of laughter. The effort visible and losing ground rapidly. "It is a little bit terrible." "Mm-hmm," Kaylin hummed softly, returning his attention to his food. She laughed again, quietly this time, and she did not cover her mouth. After that day, something loosened between them that possessed no formal name. She started talking to him the way she apparently talked when she forgot to be careful, which was directly, curiously, and without any particular ceremony or submissive deference. She asked about the layout of the northern keep, about the shifting territory boundaries, and about how the Grand Pack Council worked at the regional level versus the local villages. She possessed, Kaylin discovered, a genuine and highly specific intelligence regarding how large systems functioned. She understood instinctively who held true power, how decisions actually moved through a social structure, and how that differed from how they were supposed to move on paper. She had simply never been allowed in an environment that invited her to use that sharp mind. He asked her once where she had learned to read terrain so accurately. She told him she had taught herself mostly. She explained that she had spent a vast amount of time outdoors as a child, because being in the woods was infinitely easier than being inside her family's tense home. She said it without a shred of self-pity, offering it as a plain, unchangeable fact of her past. And she moved the conversation forward before he could follow the thread. He let her move on, but Kaylin pulled that thread in his own mind and held onto it tightly. She shared things without even realizing she was sharing them. Small, heartbreaking pieces of a life spent largely in the service of other people's comfort. It was a history of making herself smaller, quieter, and less noticeable in rooms where she had decided her mere presence was already asking too much. She offered these fragments lightly, incidentally, attached to other stories, like brief footnotes. Kaylin collected every single one. He said very little about himself, as he rarely did, but he listened to her with the kind of absolute attention that had become rare enough in his heavy life that he had nearly forgotten he was capable of it. It was complete, unhurried, and genuinely interested attention. The kind of listening that had absolutely nothing to do with political strategy or royal duty. Deep within him, his wolf was restless in a way it hadn't been in years. It felt warm, alert, and was constantly reaching towards something just outside the current range of his understanding. Kaylin noticed the internal stirring, but he rationalized it as the result of unfamiliar company, a disrupted routine, and the general irregularity of their current situation. He did not look at the feeling any more closely than that. Not yet. The way station sat squarely at the crossing of two major mid-territory tracks. It was a low, sturdy stone building, permanently staffed and heavily used by traveling wolves, merchants, and pack representatives moving between the various northern settlements. It was recognized public ground, strictly neutral by long-standing historical agreement. It was the exact kind of place where personal disputes were supposed to be set aside in favor of practical necessity and shelter. Vane understood none of that. He arrived in the late afternoon with 6 aggressive wolves riding at his back, carrying a particular quality of anger that had been building for days. On the long road, that anger had curdled into something much harder, colder, and more dangerous than simple fury. This was the volatile anger of a man whose fundamental understanding of the world had been publicly shattered. He was a man who had stood at a grand ceremony gathering and watched his future asset walk out a side door. And he had spent the days since being looked at by his packmates with expressions of pity and mockery that he had no interest in interpreting. Vane rode violently into the way station yard and located them immediately. Kaylin was standing at the far end of the gravel yard, quietly speaking with the station keeper. Lyra was nearby, with Brimstone standing protectively at her shoulder, as had quickly become the stallion's habit. Several of Kaylin's royal escort stood at various strategic points around the space, appearing relaxed in the deceptive way of highly trained wolves who were never truly relaxed. Vane dismounted before his beast had fully come to a stop. "There she is."
His arrogant voice carried loudly across the yard, with the practiced projection of a man who had decided this humiliation was a public matter. The casual conversations in the way station's yard instantly slowed to a halt. Heads turned. A group of local territory wolves near the station entrance went completely still. Vane walked directly toward Kaelin, an act that was either born of immense courage or a catastrophic failure to correctly assess the lethality of the situation. Kaelin turned calmly from the station keeper and watched the furious young alpha approach with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away. "You took her," Vane shouted, loud enough for every onlooker to hear. "She was promised to me under a binding pact agreement, and you unlawfully removed her from Ironvale territory." He stopped 10 feet away, his jaw rigid and his eyes hard with malice. "That is a direct violation of pack law, and I am here to bring my property home." The yard was absolutely quiet. Kaelin said nothing. He simply looked at Vane with the chilling stillness of a man measuring an opponent and finding him significantly smaller than expected. There was no flash of anger in the king's eyes, no defensiveness, just a patient assessment that was somehow infinitely worse than any violent response Vane had prepared for. Vane's eyes snapped past the king, landing heavily on Lyra. "Get your things," he commanded, his voice dropping slightly softer now, though it was by no means an improvement. "We are going home. We can talk about the consequences of this little stunt later." And that was the precise moment. Later, Kaelin would think about it often. He would analyze the specific sequence of what happened next, the half-second window in which he had begun to draw breath to speak, intending to lay out the formal legal reality of the situation in terms that left no room for interpretation. He had the royal laws ready. His absolute authority to deliver them was not in question. But he never got the chance. Lyra stepped forward. She did not step toward Vane. She simply stepped forward out of the peripheral, protected position she had occupied and directly into the center of the conflict. Beside her, Brimstone lifted his massive head sharply, his eyes locked on her. And then he went perfectly still, watching her every move. "I left," she said. Her voice shook. The tremor was visible, audible, and entirely undisguisable. Yet she kept talking right through it. "I was not taken by anyone. I was not confused, and I was not manipulated." She held Vane's furious gaze with the focused, agonizing effort of someone who had decided that looking away was a coward's option she would no longer employ. "I heard exactly what you said before the ceremony, Vane. I heard you talking about how it did not matter whether I was your fated mate or not. I heard you say that I would belong to you completely once the wedding mark was done." She took a steadying breath. "I heard you, Vane, and so I left. That was my choice, and mine alone. I made it." The yard was absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to die down. Vane's arrogant expression fractured. The fury was still burning in his eyes, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it. It was a fault line opening in the absolute certainty of a man who had genuinely, completely, never considered the possibility that an Omega could possess a choice. He looked at her the way a person looks at a familiar piece of furniture that has suddenly stood up and spoken in a language they did not know it knew. "You do not understand what you are saying," Vane said, his voice careful now, tightly controlled.
you were frightened. You made a rash decision under immense stress, and now that you have had time to let it— I understand exactly what I am saying, she interrupted fiercely.
Lyra. Vane's voice dropped further, adopting a reasonable, almost gentle cadence that dripped with condescension.
You have a good life at home. You have people who care about you.
What you are doing right now, standing here in front of total strangers and making these wild accusations?
This is not who you are. You do not know who I am, she said quietly, her voice cutting through his manipulation. You never cared to ask. Something in that simple truth landed heavily. Lyra saw it happen, the sudden flicker in his eyes.
It was not a flicker of genuine understanding,
but rather the first unwilling contact with an idea he possessed absolutely no mental framework to comprehend. For a brief, agonizing moment, Vane looked genuinely lost. Then he reassembled his arrogant mask.
Pack loyalty, he began, his tone hardening. Pack loyalty does not require me to belong to someone who sees me merely as a possession, she said.
She spoke the words without heat, and that lack of anger was what made the statement feel entirely final.
I am not coming back with you. That is my ultimate answer, and it does not require your agreement.
Defeated by her absolute certainty, Vane snapped his gaze back to Kaelin.
Kaelin looked back at him, his expression an unreadable wall of sovereign power. Whatever Vane found in the king's eyes, and whatever calculation he frantically ran in the heavy silence that followed, it brought him to the only logical conclusion available. He was standing on neutral ground.
He had made a loud, public accusation that had been instantly and publicly dismantled, not by the terrifying Alpha King, but by the very woman he had come to violently collect. Vane turned without another word. He made a sharp, furious gesture to his waiting wolves, walked back to his horse, and mounted it.
He did not look back at Lyra again.
The yard remained dead quiet until the rapid sound of retreating hooves faded entirely down the eastern track. Then, gradually, the ordinary, mundane noise of the way station resumed around them. People began conversations anew. The station keeper returned to his ledger, and Kaelin's royal escort relaxed their postures by degrees. Kaelin looked over at Lyra. She was still standing in the exact same spot, both of her hands hanging loose at her sides, her eyes staring blankly at the wooden gate Vane had just ridden through. Her breathing was careful, deep, and deliberate, in the distinct way of someone desperately managing a massive wave of adrenaline. As Kaelin watched her, his expression was not one that any of his men recognized. They had seen him thoroughly satisfied after a successful, grueling negotiation. They had seen him grimly resolved after making a difficult executive decision. But they had never seen their king look at any person the way he looked at Lyra in that quiet moment, as if a heavy door inside him, locked tight for a lifetime, had quietly and entirely without his permission swung wide open. Something had fundamentally changed within her after that confrontation. It was not a dramatic, loud transformation, and it did not announce itself with pride. Instead, it was visible in the smallest of daily things. It was evident in the confident way she mounted Brimstone in the mornings now, moving with a natural grace rather than a hesitant negotiation with the beast. It was in the steady way she held the leather reins and the way she answered Kaelin's questions directly.
no longer softening the edges of her words first to check whether the shape of her thoughts was acceptable to a superior. She began to laugh far more easily. She took up more physical space at the campfire each evening. She stopped apologizing for having an opinion before she offered it. Kalen noticed every single one of these shifts, and he purposely said nothing. He knew that some things are incredibly fragile in their early stages of growth, and the wrong kind of attention can interrupt them. A heavy hand cupped around a vulnerable new flame can either shelter it from the wind or accidentally smother it entirely. So he simply adjusted his own behavior to match her growth. He made room for her presence without drawing any attention to the making of it. Their riding lessons had naturally, without either of them ever formally deciding it should be so. It had started out of pure practicality. Lyra's riding form was functional enough for a short flight, but it was highly inefficient over long distances. It was the rigid posture of someone self-taught under immense pressure, and over a long journey, it would cost her a great deal of physical exhaustion. Kalen had corrected her posture once, briefly, and she had listened intently and adjusted her body without a shred of defensiveness. The next day, he had corrected something else. She had asked a smart question, and he had answered it thoroughly. A week later, it had become simply a thing they did. The routine consisted of Kalen observing her movements, occasionally reaching over from his saddle to gently adjust the angle of her wrist on the reins or the position of her heel in the stirrups. Lyra absorbed his instruction with the focused, quiet attention she brought to everything she deemed worth understanding. Brimstone bore all of this meticulous tinkering with an immense, uncharacteristic patience and what appeared to be smug satisfaction. But strange, inexplicable things had been happening between the horse and the woman for longer than Kalen had formerly cared to acknowledge. He catalogued them now, reluctantly, as they rode through a vast, open stretch of lonely moorland on the 6th day out from the neutral way station. The wind came in low, biting and constant off the northern hills, carrying the bitter cold that was highly particular to high altitudes. Lyra had gone quiet in the afternoon, adopting the contemplative state she sometimes did, not distant or cold, just interior, thinking some deep thought through to its conclusion. Brimstone knew what she was feeling before Kalen did. The great stallion's head came up first. His ears went back, not in sudden alarm, but in intense attention, the focused, the supernatural orientation of an animal, reading something entirely invisible to the eye. He subtly shifted his stride, moving his massive body slightly closer to Lyra's frame, angling his torso in a protective way that was subtle enough to look accidental to an untrained eye, but wasn't. Lyra did not even notice the horse's movement. She was still looking out at the middle distance, whatever private thought she was working through still occupying her mind completely. Kalen watched the stallion's behavior and said nothing. It had happened 4 distinct times now that he had personally counted. The first was when Lyra received word via a passing messenger that the Iron Veil Pack had formally registered a bitter complaint with the regional councils regarding her sudden departure. She had kept her facial expression entirely neutral and her voice perfectly steady when she heard the news. Yet Brimstone had immediately moved his massive head to gently press his nose against her trembling shoulder before she had done anything visible to betray her distress. The second time occurred at a crowded way station, when a crass traveling merchant had said something thoughtless and derogatory
about unmated omegas traveling alone with an armed military escort.
Before Kaelin could even draw breath to intervene,
Brimstone had aggressively positioned his massive bulk directly between Lyra and the offending merchant, with the quiet, the terrifying authority of a slamming stone door. And then there were the other 2 times, incidents that bothered Kaelin far more than he wanted to admit to himself. Twice, when other young males in the royal escort had spoken to Lyra at length during a rest stop, making her laugh or holding her attention with easy banter. Kaelin's inner wolf had responded from the depths of his chest with a territorial, a protective instinct so sharp and immediate it had taken him a full, straining breath to suppress it. At the time, he had firmly attributed the feeling to a general sense of protective responsibility for a guest under his crown's care. He was rapidly becoming less convinced by that convenient explanation.
Torin pulled him aside late that afternoon when they finally stopped to water the horses at a wide, fast-moving stream crossing.
Torin was the oldest, most battle-scarred wolf in the king's escort. He was a pragmatic man, highly economical with his words, and possessed of a blunt, unfiltered honesty that Kaelin tolerated exclusively because it had proven useful over many brutal years and many difficult military situations. Torin had the particular, unbothered quality of old soldiers who had long stopped being impressed by royal rank because they had seen far too much of what that rank actually cost in blood.
He waited patiently until they were standing 10 feet away from the rest of the resting men.
"There is something I want to say," Torin said, his voice low.
"Say it," Kaelin replied.
Torin looked at his king steadily, his weathered eyes unblinking.
"I have watched you react to 3 different wolves talking to the girl in the last 2 days alone.
Each time, it takes 30 seconds, maybe less, before your inner wolf is pushing hard against your control, demanding dominance." He paused, letting the weight of his observation settle. "You covered the reaction well from the men, but not from me. I am fully aware of my own physical responses, Torin," Kaelin said, his voice tightening.
"I know you are."
Torin's voice remained perfectly even, entirely unfazed by the Alpha's warning tone. "I am not questioning your awareness, my king. I am telling you that I have seen that exact, specific, instinctual response once before in my life. 12 years ago. It was Aldrich, your 3rd sector commander."
Kaelin remained silent, his jaw tightening.
Torin delivered the final blow quietly. It happened 3 days before Aldrich recognized his fated mate. He had no earthly idea what was happening to his own mind either. The stream moved past them, rushing fast, cold, and loud over the dark, smooth stones. "Mind your current assignment, Torin," Kaelin said coldly.
"Yes, my lord," Torin replied smoothly, without giving any particular indication that he found the king's dismissive response convincing.
He turned on his heel and walked calmly back to his horse.
That night, Kaelin sat completely outside the camp's bright firelight, long after the other men had fallen into deep sleep. The fire had burned down to a mound of glowing red coals, and the ancient forest was deep, dark, and utterly quiet around him. Somewhere on the edge of the camp, Brimstone stood at his customary position, right beside Lyra's sleeping roll, a shadow among shadows. Watchful and menacing, even in his absolute stillness, Kaelin looked into the dying coals and forced himself to think about things he had spent 15 long years deliberately choosing not to think about.
He had closed that particular door on romance and fate a long time ago. He had done it practically, deliberately, and entirely without self-pity. An alpha king's life was structured in rigid ways that left certain personal desires permanently out of reach. And he had long ago made his peace with that accounting and moved forward with his duty. He had been entirely comfortable with what he had decided was simply the lonely truth of his situation. But Torin's blunt words now sat heavily in his chest like an anvil. Brimstone had known the truth from the very first moment. The royal horse had chosen her in a dark, panicked stable back in the Ironvale settlement. While Kaelin was still 3 full territories away, completely unaware that a runaway bride was about to alter the course of his life. Kaelin looked at the dying fire for a very long time. He did not sleep a single wink that night. He sent an urgent rider ahead with a message to the elderly elder woman advisor 3 days before their party finally reached the stone gates of the keep. He kept the written words brief. He asked her to meet him entirely privately upon his arrival. He gave no official reason for the meeting, which she, in her immense wisdom, would understand was itself a significant reason. Kaelin did not request private audiences with his oldest, most trusted advisor for matters that could be handled through normal bureaucratic channels. There were perhaps 4 people in the entire Northern Territories whose judgment he trusted completely. And this elderly advisor had been the very first name on that shortlist since he was 19 years old. She was waiting patiently for him in the small stone antechamber located just off the main corridor when he finally arrived. She was seated gracefully beside a narrow glass window with a cup of warm tea held between her wrinkled hands, looking exactly as she always looked, unhurried, deeply attentive. Like someone who had been expecting this exact conversation for days and had simply been waiting for him to schedule it. Kaelin walked into the room and closed the heavy wooden door behind him. He remained standing, which was his deeply ingrained habit. He always thought more clearly on his feet, and he desperately wanted to think clearly for this. He laid out the facts of the journey in the exact order they had occurred, presenting them sequentially. He detailed Brimstone's bizarre behavior at the Ironvale borders. He explained the undeniable pattern of fierce protective instinct that had followed the horse. He confessed his own wolf's volatile territorial response to other males standing near Lyra. Finally, he reported Torin's blunt observation at the stream crossing. He delivered the entire narrative the way he delivered official military intelligence reports, precise, sequential, and entirely devoid of emotional weight. When he finally finished speaking, the elderly advisor looked up at him over the porcelain rim of her cup. "Is that a question?" she asked softly. "I want your honest assessment," Kaelin stated. "My assessment," she said, setting her cup down with a soft click, "is that you already know the answer. You are only here because you desperately want someone else to confirm it out loud, so that acting upon it feels less like a monumental decision you made all alone." Kaelin looked at her, his facade dropping for a fraction of a second. "You are not wrong," he admitted. The elderly advisor smiled faintly. She was 83 years old, a romantic with stark white hair and piercing dark eyes that had always seen straight through his armor with an ease he had found deeply uncomfortable at 19, and had learned to value completely by 30. She had known his father well, and she had stood firmly in this same stone keep through 3 bloody leadership transitions.
2 brutal territorial wars and more pack crises than either of them could accurately count.
Very little in this world surprised her anymore.
I knew the truth within a single day of hearing about the theft of the horse, she said plainly. Brimstone has been your wolf's perfect mirror since the day you bonded him.
He recognizes what your wolf recognizes, and sometimes he does it significantly faster.
She paused, letting her eyes hold his. The horse found her first because he was actively paying attention to the universe, and you were not.
I was not present, Kaelin defended, his voice low. I was 3 entire territories away when she took him.
Your wolf was not away, she countered simply, without a shred of drama. Distance does not interrupt a true mate bond in its early waking stages, Magnus. Distance just makes it harder for the rational mind to identify. She leaned forward slightly, counting the evidence on her fingers.
The fierce, protective instinct, the wolf's clawing restlessness. The absolute way everything in your spirit settles into peace the moment she is nearby.
Kaelin, you have been standing there describing a fated mate bond to me for 20 minutes.
You have simply been using other, colder words to avoid saying it.
The stone antechamber fell into a profound quiet.
Outside the narrow window, the keep's bustling courtyard was visible under a gray sky, showing the ordinary, the comforting movement of people going about their daily winter work. Kaelin stood with this reality the way he stood with all difficult, earth-shattering information. He turned it over in his mind, examined the sharp edges, and looked intensely for any places where the theory might be wrong. Incomplete, or merely the result of confirmation bias applied to ambiguous evidence. He found very few errors, and that reality, more than anything the elderly advisor had said, was what finally settled the matter in his heart. He walked for a very long time after leaving her presence. He marched through the keep's dim lower corridors, out through the massive eastern gate, and along the wall's exposed outer path, where the wind came in hard and freezing off the northern hills. There was no one out there to observe him thinking. He had always done his most honest, brutal thinking in constant motion, in the freezing air,
and in wide open spaces, where the immense weight of the great hall, the council table,
and the accumulated expectations of 15 years of unyielding leadership were slightly easier to set aside. He had closed the door on a fated mate a long time ago, and he had not done it bitterly. He wanted to be absolutely clear with himself about that fact. It had not been an act of bitterness, resignation, or the aching longing of someone who believed they deserved more than life was giving them. It had been a highly practical, necessary accounting of his reality.
He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. The position had immense costs. The years had heavy costs.
He had paid every single one of them without a word of complaint, and he had successfully built a kingdom worth protecting.
He had reached a quiet,
settled conclusion somewhere around his 35th year that a fated mate bond was simply not a feature destined to exist within the architecture of his life. Kaelin had been comfortable with that reality. Yet, as he examined that comfort now, standing high upon the stone ramparts, he recognized that it had always been a somewhat artificial construct itself. It was a structure meticulously built, heavily maintained, and occasionally repaired during those silent, heavy hours just before dawn when Blackwood Keep fell entirely still, and the loneliness was most honest about its true dimensions. Lyra was not a woman he would have ever imagined. He recognized the profound inadequacy of that thought the moment it formed. To say she was unexpected implied he had been actively imagining someone specific over the years, which he hadn't. Imagining a partner had always felt like a very particular, a refined kind of cruelty he had consciously chosen not to practice upon himself. But if he had allowed his mind to wander, he certainly would not have dreamed up someone who would openly argue with him regarding the correct direction of a forest trail, and happened to be entirely right. He would not have envisioned a woman who instinctively checked his majestic stallion's legs for injury before ensuring her own basic safety. He would not have pictured a runaway bride who could stand in a chaotic, public backyard with a visibly shaking voice and completely refuse to stop speaking until she was heard. She was a woman who made him genuinely want to laugh in the middle of the most serious, weighted conversations, and then looked entirely, beautifully surprised when he actually did. No, she was not who he would have imagined. She was considerably better. The true problem presented itself with absolute clarity, the way hard problems always did once he stopped trying to look away from them. Lyra had spent her entire life being told exactly what she was worth by people who had already decided the answer for her long before she could speak. She had been assigned, arranged, spoken for, and meticulously managed by every single person in her orbit. She had accepted a diminished version of herself, built entirely from the bricks of other people's convenience. If he simply approached her now and informed her of the ancient, cosmic bond pulsing between them, she would not truly hear the beauty of it. Where he meant to say, "You are my fated mate," she would only hear, "Here is yet another powerful man deciding your future for you." Kaelin stood on the cold stone wall walk, with the biting northern wind pressing hard against his face. Understanding with devastating clarity that he had no idea how to tell her the absolute truth in a way that she would actually be capable of receiving. It was a problem worth solving with the utmost care. He simply needed to find the right words. He had not found them yet when Chapter 9 began. He ultimately chose the quiet of the evening to speak to her. That was his first distinct miscalculation. It was not the worst error he would make, but it was the one that ultimately shaped every single thing that followed. He had spent 3 agonizing days trying to arrange the correct words in his mind, arriving at something that finally felt completely honest, careful, and sufficiently considered. He chose the evening because the day's long riding was done, because the camp had fallen quiet, and because there was the warm glow of firelight and that particular comforting stillness that had become, over their weeks of travel, a sacred space where they both spoke far more freely to one another than they ever did while in motion. He had completely failed to account for the fact that stillness also made things much harder to escape. Lyra was sitting quietly on the flat, smooth rock she had claimed as her customary evening seat. Brimstone was grazing nearby, and her attention was fixed on the middle distance, her gaze drifting in the specific way it always did when she was deeply thinking through something she hadn't yet decided how to put into words. She looked up the moment Kaelin came to sit across from her. She read something intense and deliberate in his expression, and she simply waited. He told her directly, because, in the end, he did not know any other way to deliver a truth so heavy. "There is something I need to tell you," he said,
his voice low against the crackle of the wood.
I have been working out exactly how to say it correctly, and I am not entirely certain I have managed it.
But waiting any longer simply does not feel right either. He paused, holding her gaze. You are my fated mate, Lyra.
He watched her face intently. Surprise came first, the genuine, completely unguarded kind that arrives instantly, before the conscious mind can gather itself to moderate an emotion. Her lips parted slightly in the firelight. Her eyes moved rapidly over his features, searching every line of his face, as if desperately checking whether he could possibly mean something entirely different from what he had just spoken aloud. Then came a wave of wonder. It was brief, undefended, and painfully honest. A reflection of something deep within her that truly wanted this. Wanting it with a desperate completeness she was entirely unable to hide in the brief half-second before her intellect caught up with what she was feeling. Then came the shutting. It happened precisely the way a heavy wooden door slams shut in a sudden violent gust of wind. It was not slow, and it was not performed with dramatic flair. It was just sudden, absolute, and then it was entirely closed. Her expression did not break or collapse into tears. It simply withdrew. Her spirit went somewhere entirely interior, quiet and very far away from the warmth of the firelight. She looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. "Would you have looked for me?" she asked, her voice deliberately careful, leveled to a flat, emotionless plane. "If brimstone had not gone with me, if there had been absolutely nothing unusual about my escape, if someone had just casually told you a common horse was stolen from Ironvale territory?" She paused, letting the silence stretch between them. Would any of this have happened? Kalen opened his mouth to reply, and here occurred his worst, most devastating miscalculation. It was not born of cruelty or carelessness, but rather from the stubborn instinct of an inherently honest man who had not yet understood that certain profound questions require far more than mere literal honesty to answer well. He could have said, "I fell in love with you long before I ever understood why." He could have told her, "The bond merely explains what was already entirely true between us." He could have led with the roaring depths of what he felt in his heart, rather than what he knew to be factually true in his head. Instead, he spoke the bare truth. "I cannot tell you with absolute certainty what I would have done, without knowing what I know now. What I can tell you is that what I feel right now is enough," she said quietly. She was not angry, and that was the precise thing that completely undid him. She spoke the words with the soft, tragic finality of someone who had just received the exact answer they had already deeply suspected, and had been desperately hoping to be wrong about. "Kalen, you deserve someone who was chosen completely freely," she said, her eyes fixed firmly on the dancing flames, refusing to meet his gaze. "You do not deserve a woman assigned to you by an ancient bond that neither of you ever asked for. You deserve someone who was actually selected by you, because you wanted her specifically above all others." She paused, swallowing hard against the tightening in her throat. Not because fate made the ultimate decision and your wolf simply followed the biological instruction. That is not what this is. I will not be something that just happened to you. She said it without a shred of heat, without an ounce of accusation, delivering it like a firm decision she had already completely finished making and was now simply reporting to him after the fact. I have spent my entire life being something that happened to other people. Something convenient, something neatly arranged, something predictable that fit perfectly into whatever space was available. She finally turned her head to look at him directly. Her eyes were completely dry, but the effort cost her something immense. He could see the structural cost of her composure clearly written in the lines of her shoulders. You are a good man, Kaylin. You deserve so much better than a bond you did not choose yourself, and a mate who will spend the rest of her days always wondering. He said her name again, a plea hanging in the air between them. Yes, she murmured softly. She shook her head just once, a small, utterly final gesture. She quietly wished him a good night, walked over to her bedroll, and lay down. She was entirely gone before the first gray rays of light broke over the eastern horizon. Kaylin woke up to the sound of brimstone, and that was the sensory detail that reached his consciousness first. It was not the peace of silence or the stark realization of her absence, but the frantic movement of the great stallion. Brimstone was moving in a tight, panicked circle right at the very edge of the clearing. His massive hooves striking the damp earth with a frantic, broken rhythm that was entirely wrong. It was the frantic, agitated movement of an animal in profound distress. A low, agonizing sound vibrated from the beast's chest. Not quite a whinny, not quite a cry, but something desperate between the two that Kaylin had never once heard from the horse in all of their 9 years together. Kaylin was on his feet before his mind was fully awake. He immediately saw the empty bedroll, the absolute absence of her traveling pack, and the missing pair of small, worn leather boots she always neatly left right beside her blanket. It was the perfectly ordinary, devastating blankness of a physical space that had been vacated with immense care, quietly, without a single shred of disruption. It was the clean exit of someone deeply practiced in the art of leaving a place without ever being noticed. Brimstone stopped his frantic circling the exact moment Kaylin appeared. The horse stood perfectly still, looking at his master with dark, intelligent eyes that held an accusation so direct and so plainly communicative that Kaylin was forced to look away from it. He had finally found the right words, but he had found them entirely too late. He stood frozen in the cold, a romantic whip, the early light of the empty camp, and felt the phantom ache of the mate bond register her absence, the exact way a physical body slowly registers a severe wound. It did not hit him all at once, but rather in spreading, numbing increments, each passing second clarifying the terrifying dimension of what had just occurred. She had done it yet again. She had made herself smaller, folded her own desires away, and decided that someone else's definition of what was deserved was far more important than her own happiness. And he had given her just enough silent room to do it. Brimstone walked over and pressed his massive nose hard against Kaylin's shoulder, a heavy, grounding weight. Kaylin placed his hand flat against the stallion's warm neck, stood completely still, and began to think about what came next with the laser-focused, the narrowed attention of a man who has just realized exactly how badly he miscalculated and has absolutely no intention of making the same mistake twice.
In Chapter 10, Vane found her at a small way station village located roughly 2 hours south of the Northern Territory border. She had been there for less than a single day. She had arrived in the early evening, paid for a modest room with the tiny amount of coin she had managed to gather together, and was already meticulously planning her next escape route when she heard the distinct sound of horses entering the stone yard below. The sound reached her ears long before the voices did. She knew, with the sharp, survivalist instinct of someone who has spent years reading the exact texture of approaching trouble, exactly what those hoofbeats meant. She went swiftly to the window and looked down. Vane stood in the yard below, flanked by 2 gray-robed pack elders from her home territory and 4 heavily built wolves guarding his back. He was not wearing the furious expression of a jilted man who had come to argue or beg. He was wearing the cold, smug expression of a man who had come completely prepared. That was infinitely worse. He looked up and located her in the window without even needing to search, which meant he had known exactly where she was hiding before he even arrived in the village. He had been tracking her trail, waiting, perhaps, for exactly this specific vulnerability, for her to be completely alone, isolated outside of Kalen's protective northern territory. Standing on ground where traditional pack law possessed far more reach than northern royal decrees. He almost looked genuinely sorry about the situation. That was the most sickening part of all. They sat across from her at the way station's small, scratched common table. Vane sat to her left, while the 2 elders arranged themselves with the chilling neutrality of people merely performing a holy function they believed in with all their hearts. One of them began to read aloud from a folded piece of heavy parchment in a measured, monotonous voice. It was the original mating agreement. He read the names of the witnesses registered at Ironvale and the formal complaints of a runaway mate filed with 3 separate territory offices. Everything was perfectly documented, precisely dated, and procedurally flawless. Lyra sat with her hands pressed flat against the wood of the table, listening to the heavy, grinding machinery of her old life. She had grown up entirely inside this legal machinery. She knew its rhythmic sounds. She knew exactly how it moved, not with overt cruelty, not with loud violence, but with the implacable, the crushing forward motion of a societal system built by people who simply never thought to leave any space for a woman to say the word no. It wasn't born of active malice. That was what she had always found most utterly defeating about it. It was just the way things had always been done, and the way things were done had never once paused to ask whether she found it acceptable. Vane leaned forward over the table, the exact moment the elder finished reading. "I am not here to punish you, Lyra," he said, his voice quiet, mimicking gentleness. "I want you to understand that completely. I just want to bring you back home where you belong." She looked at him. He actually meant it. She had understood this terrifying truth about him from the very beginning, and it had never made her situation a single bit easier to bear. He was not a cartoonish villain who knew he was a villain. He was simply an entitled man who had constructed a complete, detailed, and unshakable vision of her entire life. And he was genuinely, truly puzzled by her failure to be incredibly grateful for it. "I know you truly mean that, Vane," she said, her voice steady. His expression opened up slightly,
a glint of something close to smug relief appearing in his eyes.
But it does not change my answer in the slightest.
The relief instantly vanished from his features. Lyra straightened her spine in the hard wooden chair, turned away from him, and looked directly at the elder sitting on the right, the older of the two, the one whose historical documentation had been far more thorough.
I want to formally invoke the right of refusal, she said clearly, her voice echoing in the small room. I am invoking it under Northern Territory law. Specifically, Article 9 of the Ancestral Compact, which predates the Ironvale Pact's founding charter by approximately 60 years.
And directly supersedes any pack-level mating agreement in cases where documented, explicit consent was not freely given by both parties. The elder froze, staring at her in absolute shock. Vane stared at her, his jaw tightening in sudden fury.
I have been a continuous resident of the Northern Territory borderlands for the past several weeks, she continued.
Refusing to let them speak, which legally grants me provisional standing under Northern Crown law. I am invoking that legal standing right now, formally, in front of these witnesses. She turned her head and looked at Vane directly, looking straight into his eyes. I reject this mating agreement. I reject the bond. I reject this entire procedure. She paused, letting every single word land. Those are my words. I said them myself. Write them down in your records, exactly as I have spoken them. The common room fell completely, utterly still. The silence stretched so thin it felt as though it might snap. Then the heavy wooden door swung wide open. Kaelin did not enter the room the way men typically enter a space when they desperately want everyone present to understand their authority. He had absolutely no need for such displays. He simply walked through the threshold, and the entire room immediately reorganized itself around his sheer presence, the way rooms always did. The soldier stationed near the back wall instantly went rigid, and the two gray-robed elders straightened their spines. It was the the heavy atmospheric shift of a physical space that has just been entered by someone entirely accustomed to changing the exact weight of every single room he ever walked into. He took in the entire scene in a single comprehensive look. He crossed the floor straight to where Lyra was sitting. He did not step in front of her to shield her like a fragile object. Instead, he stood directly beside her, his broad shoulder perfectly parallel to her shoulder, facing the exact same direction, standing as an equal. He looked down at the elders with an expression that was perfectly civil, remarkably calm, and absolutely, completely immovable. The Northern Territories formally recognize this woman's invocation of Article 9, Kaelin said, his deep voice carrying an unshakable weight. Her choice has been made. It has been documented, and it will be fully enforced under the absolute authority of my crown.
He turned his eyes to Vane. There is no legal avenue remaining to you. This matter is entirely finished.
Vane held the Alpha King's gaze for a long, agonizingly tense moment, trying to find a tremor of doubt and finding nothing but stone. Then he stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his heavy coat with the deliberate movements of a man desperately trying to figure out how to carry something incredibly heavy and humiliating out of a room. He did not speak a single word to Lyra again. He turned and walked straight to the door with his wolves trailing silently behind him, and he did not look back. The door clicked shut.
the heavy machinery of her old life ground to a permanent halt. They eventually found a beautiful place, well outside the confines of the village, as the late afternoon light began to go long and gold through the ancient pines. It was a flat, lush stretch of green grass, right near the banks of a slow-moving, clear creek. Brimstone was grazing a few yards away, moving with the total contentment of an animal who had been running incredibly hard and knew he had fully earned his rest. Kaelin sat down on the grass beside her, remaining entirely quiet for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. He did not speak to her about the cosmic mate bond, nor did he talk about fate or wolves, or anything else that could ever be mistaken for a lingering sense of obligation. Instead, he told her the truth about 15 long years of living inside a great stone hall that had been built specifically to make men feel small, and how that heavy architecture had eventually started working its silent magic on him, too. He spoke of endless council tables, bitter territorial disputes, and the suffocating silence of a massive room that empties out entirely when a meeting is concluded, never refilling with anything personal or warm. He told her about the exact moment he had heard her laugh for the very first time, the real laugh, the unbridled one she had quickly clapped her hand over, as if trying to hide it. He described the strange, incredibly specific shock of recognition that had hit him then, like suddenly hearing a beautiful sound he had entirely forgotten he was missing in his life. He told her about her stubbornness, her sharp trail corrections, the beautiful way she checked on Brimstone's well-being before her own, and the brave way she had stood in that crowded way station yard with a visibly shaking voice and absolutely refused to stop talking. He told her, his voice softening, that he had fallen completely in love with every single piece of all of it, long before he ever had a formal name for any of it. "The bond did not create what I feel," he said, looking at her. "It just arrived entirely late to the conversation, merely explaining what was already completely true between us." Lyra looked out at the rippling water of the creek for a very long time. She thought deeply about all the many times in her life she had been chosen, assigned, arranged, and decided upon by others, and how every single one of those moments had always felt like a traumatic event happening to her. Rather than a life she was an active part of building, she thought about what it truly felt like to sit right beside this immense man. She thought about how he had stood directly beside her today in the way station, not stepping in front of her to take away her agency, but standing shoulder to shoulder with her. She thought about how he had always consciously made room for her existence, rather than taking up all the space for himself. She turned her head and looked at him. He waited. He was remarkably, beautifully good at waiting for her. Slowly, she reached across the space between them and found his hand with her own. His long fingers closed securely around hers, without a single moment of hesitation, without any grand ceremony, settling with the absolute ease of something that had always belonged in exactly that position and was simply, finally, home. Brimstone lifted his massive head from the sweet grass and looked across the clearing at the two of them with his dark, patient, intelligent eyes. The warm afternoon light held over the valley. Neither of them spoke a word.
For the absolute first time in either of their lives, there was absolutely nothing left to decide. There was no rigid procedure to follow, no political arrangement to satisfy, and no ancient bond requiring her forced compliance or his solemn duty. There was only a choice freely made in the quiet woods and the deep, unhurried joy of two people who had finally, after everything they had endured, found exactly where they were always supposed to be.
Lyra had never wanted to be a remarkable figure of legend. She had just wanted to be asked what she wanted. That is the quiet, beating heart of this entire story. It is not about the legendary horse. It is not about the powerful king. And it is not about the ancient bond that fate arrogantly arranged without ever consulting either of them first. It is about the exact moment a woman who spent her entire existence being decided upon finally opens her mouth and decides for herself. And it is about the moment a man who possessed absolutely everything in the world, except someone who saw his true soul, finally stopped being looked at as a king and started being known as a man. The mate bond did not save them. They saved each other first. Before you go, if this story stayed with you, if you found yourself rooting fiercely for a girl in a ruined white wedding dress who just wanted one honest choice in her life, then you already know exactly what this channel is about. Hit subscribe so you never miss a single new story. Every single week brings a completely new world, a brand new flame, and a new reason to stay until the very last word is spoken. Leave a comment below and tell me exactly which moment hit your heart the hardest. I read every single one of them. And if someone in your life right now needs a gentle reminder that they are absolutely allowed to choose themselves, please share this story with them. A brand new story is coming very soon. Don't miss it.